Okay, so, we always appreciate you sending us interesting stuff. And this time is no different. You guys sent us some news about Ethiopia and the Red Sea and what Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been saying about it all, and it's a lot to digest. So that's what we are going to do today. We're going to kind of like take apart everything he has said about Ethiopia and the Red Sea and see what we can learn from it.
It is a lot, and it is pretty complex.
Yeah.
But there are some really fascinating things here that we can definitely learn from.
Yeah, and I mean, right off the bat, we should probably acknowledge that a lot of this stuff, particularly when you start getting into Eritrea, is, kind of sensitive, and there are a lot of strong feelings involved.
Oh, absolutely.
This is a region with a lot of history, and a lot of that history involves, conflict and tension. So when you start talking about things like sea access and borders and national interests, it's understandable that people are going to be a little on edge. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So what we want to do today is really take a look at what Abiy Ahmed has actually said and try to understand, what he's trying to accomplish, what his goals are, and what this all means for Ethiopia and the wider region.
It is a really important story, and it is one that deserves a careful and balanced look.
Absolutely. So why don't we start with maybe the most, eye-catching statement, the one that really got people talking.
Yeah, so that would have to be his statement from March 20th of this year, where he directly addressed the Ethiopian parliament and said, and I am quoting here, Ethiopia has no intention of invading Eritrea over the Red Sea.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty direct. And I think the fact that he chose to say this in Parliament is significant, right?
Very significant. I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't some offhand comment to a reporter. It was a formal declaration to the nation's representatives.
So what do you think that tells us?
Well, I think it tells us a couple of things. First of all, it tells us that this whole idea of Ethiopia, using force to gain access to the Red Sea is something that is being talked about, both within Ethiopia and internationally.
Right. And I mean, I remember back in October of last year when he made that statement about Ethiopia's access to the sea being a matter of survival.
Oh, yeah. That was a really powerful statement, and it definitely got people's attention.
And I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Like Ethiopia is a big country with a huge population and a rapidly growing economy, and being landlocked creates all sorts of, challenges.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about all the goods that need to be imported and exported, all the raw materials that need to come in, and all the finished products that need to go out.
Mhm.
And all that has to go through neighboring countries, through their ports and their infrastructure. It's a huge vulnerability.
Right. And it creates a situation where Ethiopia's economic well-being is to some extent, at the mercy of its neighbors.
Exactly. And that's a position that no country wants to be in, especially a country with the ambitions that Ethiopia has.
So do you think this latest statement about not invading Eritrea is a way of, trying to calm things down a bit?
I think it's definitely part of that. I think he's trying to reassure Eritrea and the international community that Ethiopia is not going to resort to military force.
And it also seems like he's trying to lay out an alternative path forward, right? He talks about, discussing Ethiopia's interests and taking a give and take, a people to people, and a market-based approach.
Yeah, that's really interesting language, and it suggests a very different kind of strategy, one that's based on diplomacy and economic cooperation rather than military might.
And he was very clear about rejecting war. He said there is no need for war.
Right. And I think that's really important to emphasize because there's always a risk in these situations that things could escalate.
So what do you think a market-based approach to sea access would actually look like in this part of the world?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think there are a number of possibilities that could involve things like long-term lease agreements for port facilities or joint ventures to develop new infrastructure.
I was going to ask about that. Like, is he talking about building new ports or expanding existing ones?
It could be both.
Yeah.
It really depends on what's feasible and what makes the most economic sense. It could also involve things like, preferential trade agreements or guarantees of access to existing ports in exchange for investment or other forms of cooperation.
Right. So it's about finding a solution that works for everyone involved.
Exactly. And that's going to be the real challenge, isn't it? Because everyone has their own interests and priorities.
And he wasn't just talking about Eritrea. He also mentioned Somalia, Djibouti, and Kenya, and he described the Red Sea as a common resource.
Right. And that's an important point to make because he's trying to frame this not as a zero-sum game, but as something that can benefit everyone.
Yeah, he even said something about the region having 5,000 kilometers of coastline, and there should be enough to go around.
Right. He's basically saying, look, we're not trying to take anything away from anyone. We just want a fair share.
But I mean, come on, that sounds a little idealistic, doesn't it?
Maybe. But I think it's important to understand that he's trying to change the narrative here. He's trying to move away from this idea of Ethiopia as a aggressive expansionist power.
But he also directly addressed those rumors of conflict with Eritrea.
He did, and I think that was really smart because rumors can be incredibly damaging, especially in a region like this.
Oh, yeah, they can spiral out of control really quickly and lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and miscalculations.
Exactly. So by directly addressing those rumors and reassuring both Ethiopians and Eritreans that there is no plan to invade too, he's trying to prevent things from escalating.
So let's think about Somalia for a minute, because that's another piece of this puzzle that's really important.
Yeah, the whole situation with Somaliland and the memorandum of understanding that Ethiopia signed with them is really fascinating.
Okay, so for those who might not be totally up to speed on this, can you kind of give us the background?
Sure. So basically, Somaliland declared independence from Somalia back in 1991, but that independence is not internationally recognized.
Right. And I remember there was a lot of controversy when Ethiopia signed that agreement with Somaliland because it involved giving Ethiopia access to a port and a military base.
Yeah, it was a pretty big deal, and it definitely ruffled some feathers in Somalia, which still considers Somaliland to be part of its territory.
And that led to some pretty serious tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia, right?
It did. And ultimately, they ended up reaching a peace agreement under the auspices of Turkey.
Which is really interesting because it shows how complicated these relationships are. It's not just a simple matter of Ethiopia versus Eritrea or Ethiopia versus Somalia. It's a whole web of alliances and rivalries.
Right. And you have to remember that external powers are also involved in this. You have countries like the U.S. and China and the Gulf states all vying for influence in the Horn of Africa.
So it's not just a regional issue, it's a global issue.
Exactly. And that makes it even more complex.
So getting back to Abiy Ahmed, he made a statement that really caught my attention. He said, "We do not have to worry that any country can invade Ethiopia and stop us from the dream we have started."
Yeah, that was a pretty strong statement, and I think it's important to understand what he's trying to convey here.
It almost sounded like a warning.
I think it was a warning, but it was also a statement of confidence.
Mm-hmm.
He's basically saying that Ethiopia is prepared to defend itself and its interests.
And he also clarified that this preparation is to stop the war.
Right, so he's framing it as a defensive posture.
Yeah.
We're not preparing for aggression, we're preparing to prevent it.
So this is all about deterrence.
Exactly, it's about sending a message that Ethiopia is not going to be bullied or pushed around.
And it seems like he's also trying to shift the narrative around this whole issue of sea access.
Oh, absolutely. He said that raising the seaport issue is no longer a shame.
Which is really interesting because for a long time, Ethiopia kind of downplayed this issue. They didn't want to seem too aggressive or demanding.
Right, but now they're being much more upfront about it.
Yeah.
They're basically saying, look, we're a major country, we have legitimate needs, and we're not going to apologize for pursuing them.
And he even appealed to international norms, saying that there's no country in the world that doesn't have a seaport and that it should be a principle of give and take.
Right, he's trying to legitimize Ethiopia's claims by framing them within a broader context. He's saying this isn't something unique to Ethiopia. This is something that every country deserves.
Okay, so he's playing a lot of different angles here. He's reassuring Eritrea, he's emphasizing diplomacy, he's appealing to international norms, and he's also projecting strength and confidence.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so fascinating because it's a really complex diplomatic balancing act.
But there's also a very practical side to all of this, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Right now, Ethiopia handles something like 95% of its exports through the port of Djibouti.
Wow, 95%. That's incredible.
It is. And it shows just how vulnerable Ethiopia is. If something were to happen to that relationship with Djibouti, if there were to be some kind of political or economic crisis,
Yeah.
Ethiopia's economy would be crippled.
Right, and that's why this whole issue of sea access is so existential for them.
It's about survival. It's about economic development. It's about national pride.
And I think it's important to remember that Ethiopia actually used to have a coastline.
Oh, that's right. Before Eritrea gained independence in 1993,
Yeah.
Ethiopia had access to the Red Sea through the ports of Mitsiwa and Assab.
And that was a really significant part of their history. They had a navy, they had a maritime tradition.
Right. And then suddenly, with Eritrea's independence, all of that was gone.
Yeah.
And Ethiopia became landlocked.
So this whole situation isn't just some abstract geopolitical dispute. It has real historical and emotional weight to it.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's often overlooked in these discussions.
So where does all of this leave us? I mean, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that Ethiopia is serious about gaining access to the Red Sea. This is not some passing whim. This is a core national interest.
And they're willing to pursue it through a variety of means.
Right. They're open to diplomacy. They're open to economic cooperation, but they're also prepared to defend themselves if necessary.
And I think the other big takeaway is that this issue is incredibly complex, and there are no easy solutions.
No, there aren't. It's going to require a lot of careful negotiation and compromise from all sides.
So for you, the listener, think about this. What do you think the most likely outcome of all this is? Is there a peaceful solution that can satisfy everyone's needs? Or are we headed for more conflict and instability in the Horn of Africa? It's a question that deserves some serious thought, and I hope we've given you some of the tools you need to start thinking about it. Thanks for joining us.